Welcome to another episode of Pilates Elephants. Great to be here with you. Today we are going to discuss the topic of prenatal Pilates is just Pilates. And I'm here with my friend and colleague, Hailey Hawkins. Hey, Hailey.
Hey, Raph. How you going?
Yeah, awesome. Great to be here with you. How are you?
Oh, I'm pretty awesome too because I get to be here. Long time listener, first time visitor.
Can you introduce yourself to the Pilates stratosphere, please?
Sure. I'm Hailey. I am a trainer for Breathe Education. I am about to be a mum of 2. I'm also a registered nurse and a Pilates instructor in my free time.
Okay. And so what we're going to talk about today, like a lot of those things have a direct bearing on what we're going to talk about today, which is prenatal Pilates really is just Pilates with 4 simple considerations. But there's an incredibly powerful mythology in the Pilates world that prenatal Pilates needs to be gentle, safe, highly modified, complicated, that you need some kind of PhD to, work with pregnant women or something. Whereas really, it could hardly be simpler if it tried.
It's just like teaching any other human being. Like, really, at the crux of it, you've got a person in front of you, you teach them movement. There's somehow been this line drawn of, as you said, you need to be a PhD or almost like they're expecting Pilates instructors to be women's health physios when we're not. We're Pilates instructors.
Right. And so I want to get into why we think that myth, exists. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, but and why it's not true presently. But firstly, I'd like to just ask you about your Pilates practice, because really the thing that precipitated us having this conversation was, you've been practicing right through your pregnancy. What are you now, 8 months, 7.5 months, something like that?
I am nearly 37 weeks.
Yeah, so you're right up there. That's what they define as full term. So 36 weeks plus is defined as full term. So you're fully gestated, essentially. And right through your pregnancy, I've been watching you on social media, plus also in the masterclasses that you teach at Breathe Education and tutorials that you teach, stuff, just, hopping on a reformer and doing swan dive when you're 5 months pregnant, high bridge, all basically the full repertoire with a few simple modifications. And I've also observed a few kind of brain explosion emojis, being posted in response to your practice, which, your practice when pregnant looks very, very similar to your practice when you're not pregnant, with a couple of, small, simple differences. So can you start off, please, by just telling the listeners about your Pilates practice and how that has, basically what is your Pilates practice, and how has it evolved, or if at all, over the stages of your pregnancy?
Sure. So, yes, you're right. I'm still doing the OG moves. I did the full swan yesterday in a tutorial. Just here we go. So I think this time around my Pilates practice was exactly the same as my prior to being pregnant Pilates practice for a very long chunk of time. I was still doing all of my instructor reformer classes, which is, yes, a lot of high bridge, a lot of walkovers, a lot of swan, a lot of that stuff, till late 20s. In my 30s, the 30 plus weeks, things have slowed down a little bit, less comfortable in sort of those really deep extension shapes, like walking over from the box to the back of the carriage. It's not happening anymore. And full hundreds probably is not as comfortable. But, I think if I compare that to my first pregnancy, I was told to stop doing things at 13 weeks. So I look at what I have been able to do this time around in maintaining my practice, staying a part of my community, staying part of my groups, made such a difference.
So the thing that has really changed then for you in the last, month or two, since you have slowed your practice down a little, is really just the comfort level because of your size, essentially.
Yeah, it's 100%. Like, so much of me that still wants to be able to do it, but there is a comfort element in it that I just don't have the room or the space to do those things anymore.
And so I'm sure that people who are listening are dying to figure out or learn how you do swan on the long box when you're 30 weeks pregnant.
Well, I've always maintained swan on the long box is about your placement on the box. And if you get down low enough, then being pregnant doesn't stop you from doing the movement. You can still do the full thing, maybe just not as bendy as a non-pregnant person.
Right. So you position the edge of the box. When you say get down low enough, you mean position the edge of the box kind of midway down your upper thighs, right? That's what you like, down the thighs. So when you actually kind of fold forwards as you push out, you obviously don't, lie totally flat on the box. You kind of drape around your belly a little bit.
Sort of rest on it like a little prop.
But you don't put your full weight on it. But then you can do the full expression of the extension phase of the swan. Yeah, the first time I saw that, I was like, oh, that's like, of course, what a simple solution. You just put the box further down your thighs.
And I felt so guilty as an instructor of someone who, I had always just gone, oh, well, you don't lie on your tummy. So all of these exercises had been out. And now that I'm playing around in my new body, I can go, yeah, I can do a rocking variation. You just hang off the front of the box. And yeah, you can do grasshopper. You just hang off the front of the box. It's been really eye-opening.
Have you gone with swimming? Found a solution for that yet?
Not a good one. Not a good one.
I can imagine some kind of pregnancy massage table with a belly hole or something where you could do swimming, but the setup would be prohibitively long.
Yes.
So, all right. So essentially, I mean, and if you're listening to this, we'll pop some links to Hailey doing some practice in the show notes, but you really should have a look because essentially you're doing what most, just regular healthy adults, regardless of pregnancy status, would consider to be a pretty vigorous Pilates practice. And you've made some, simple modifications to make it pregnancy friendly, but essentially it's only in the last, 10 weeks or so that you've had to stop doing certain exercises or, modify them, significantly. And that's simply because you've got this like massive beach ball, of a midsection.
Yeah, totally. They're just not comfortable anymore. And, some days are a little bit different to others. Some days I can do a bigger back bend than other days. I'm not doing them because they're not safe, which is what I was originally told. I just avoiding them on days where they don't feel great.
Yeah, and maybe it's like the baby's sitting in a different position or whatever on any given day.
Yeah, yes. Got a lot of knees happening at the front at the moment.
So, how has the response been? Because you've been, you've been posting these workouts in public a fair bit. How's the response been?
Generally, it's pretty good. A lot of people, saying it's so nice to see this. There has been some negative comments, particularly when some of my posts have been posted by other people. Criticisms of that I'm promoting unsafe practice. There's been some reels made that have used me as a predominant example of people promoting unsafe practices in pregnancy, which hasn't felt great, but predominantly it's been very positive, which has been amazing.
It's it mystifies me that people do that when they're not actually aware of what the guidelines say about safety. Like it's like, okay, well, if you're going to go to the trouble of singling out someone and saying, oh, look at this person, they're bad and wrong. Like, wouldn't you go to the trouble of just checking, like, I'm just going to make sure I'm actually correct on this before I like make a public fool of myself. But yeah, I'm not sure how that works in people's minds.
And then I mentioned something about, if you're going to, I did another post, if you're going to promote prenatal safety culture, provide references or provide evidence to support your thing. It was a bit quiet after that.
So, all right. So why do you think now? It's so interesting to me, this topic of pregnancy and Pilates. But sort of for a paradoxical reason, like I actually find prenatal Pilates to be one of the most boring topics in the world, right? There's nothing to talk about. It's just Pilates, But what is fascinating to me about the topic is people's seemingly bottomless fascination with it. Like there's such a passionate degree of interest. And pregnancy itself is a marvelous and wonderful, miraculous process, right? But it's like the prescription or programming of exercise during pregnancy is like, it's just dead fucking boring. It's like, there's nothing to see here, folks.
It's just another person.
Why do you think that there is such a mythology and so many people hold such strong views about this based on zero evidence or very, lack of understanding of what the guidelines say?
I think it's a bit of a perfect storm. Like, there are so many prenatal people in the world, like half the population. They're usually the ones that have a strong practice in some sort of fitness anyway, so they want to continue. Somewhere along the lines, the training schools got the role of a fitness or a movement facilitator and a women's health physio, or, like a medical professional. The lines got blurred there and they haven't been untwined. So it's such an interesting topic to so many people because prenatal people are searching for classes and instructors are going, I don't know what to do with you because training school A said you can't do crunches or lie supine. And training school B said you can't do anything that works your abdominals for fear of tearing your linea alba. And training school C said you can't do anything where you split your legs apart. And it's just like, well.
Which ironically, all of those things, I would argue, are actually causing more harm and are more risky than just doing the things that they're warning against.
Yeah. And it's creating this environment where prenatal people don't have anywhere to go because studios are saying, you can't come here after 13 weeks or you can't come here after 16 weeks. And so they're feeling like, well, I'm broken because I can't go to my studio. And I just think that's so wrong.
And, I want to read a little passage from the current American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists guidelines. And I think this is basically the same as what it says in the ACSM. Let me see if I can just open this up here. Here we go. All right. So this is from the current ACOG committee opinion number 804, physical activity and exercise during pregnancy and the postpartum period from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, 2021. So it says, quote, physical activity and exercise in pregnancy are associated with minimal risks and have been shown to benefit most women. Although some modifications to exercise routines may be necessary because of normal anatomic and physiologic changes and fetal requirements. And then the next paragraph, it says, women with uncomplicated pregnancies should be encouraged to engage in aerobic and strength and conditioning exercises before, during, and after pregnancy, end quote. And, so like it doesn't get plainer than that.
It's music to my ears. Yeah, no, it doesn't.
I actually want to read a passage from the American College of Sports Medicine because I'm getting all excited about reading out
guideline-based care.
Yeah. So where is pregnancy? Just have to look through my index here.
It's not like post-it marked already with a big yellow post-it and a star sign on it.
Well, I usually use the electronic copy. Low back pain, pregnancy 186. All right. I used to know all of the page numbers in the previous edition because when the previous edition was current, we used to teach in person. And so I used to be using my paper copy, and all of our students would have a paper copy, and I'd be like, okay, turn to page 184 for low back pain, right? But now the new editions come out, and since we've been online, and so we're not physically holding the book. I'm just like, hey, here's a screenshot I took of the book. So I've forgotten.
Here's a slide of the important part.
Yeah, I've forgotten all the page numbers, or I haven't learned the page numbers for the new edition. All right, so pregnancy ACSM Guidelines for Exercise and Testing Prescription, 11th edition, 2020, American College of Sports Medicine.
Now you got to find the bit that you want.
Yeah. It is reasonable to consider the physical and psychological benefits of physical activity and negative consequences of sedentary behaviour in non-pregnant women generally apply to pregnant women. So what that says is it's actually riskier to not exercise than it is to exercise. I'll read a couple more sentences from this same passage. The health benefits of physical activity, in consultation with a healthcare provider, healthy pregnant women without contraindications, when we'll talk about what those are a bit later, are encouraged to be physically active throughout pregnancy. The health benefits of physical activity are well recognised and can include prevention of excessive gestational weight gain and gestational diabetes mellitus, decreased risk of preeclampsia and urinary incontinence, improvement of mood, reduced incidence of low back pain and caesarean section, reduced length of labour, and maintenance and improvement of cardiorespiratory fitness. In contrast, short and long-term risk associated with sedentary behaviour are of concern. Right? So what they're saying here is like, it's actually riskier to not exercise than it is to exercise. It's like, oh, well, if you exercise, if you do abdominal work, you might tear the linear elbow. And firstly, I just want to say there's absolutely, precisely, totally zero evidence that that is a true fact. Like that is just a made up thing. But even if it were true, which it's not, but even if it were true, the risks of not doing abdominal exercises are far greater than the risks of doing abdominal exercises because everything comes with a risk. Everything comes with a risk.
And I know which band camp I'd sit on when you just listed those things of gestational diabetes and preeclampsia and a little bit of possible tearing of I know which direction I'm going.
Right. So, gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, preterm labour, all of these things are potentially life-threatening for mother and baby, right? Whereas tearing of linear elbow, which is not a thing, right? Should I say more accurately, there is absolutely zero evidence, not one skerrick of low-quality evidence anywhere that abdominal exercise increases risk of linear elbow tearing. In fact, the opposite. Abdominal exercise has been shown to decrease diastasis, and we'll get into that later. But even if it was true, which it's not, it's like, well, okay, we're being safe from the made-up risk of tearing our linear elbow, and in the process of that, we're increasing risk of gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, both of which you can die of, preterm labour, caesarean section, poor mental health, weight gain, like all of, and what we could go on. There's been another 50 conditions that you would increase the risk of by not exercising during pregnancy.
By being shunned from where you are used to practicing and being told that you're too difficult to work with. Yeah.
Right. And so that, and so maybe, dear listener, if you're thinking like, oh, well, no, I'm still promoting exercise, or maybe there are people out there who are still promoting exercise, but they're just saying, hey, don't do abdominal work, right? So they're not saying, it's not a do or don't exercise thing. It's like, hey, keep exercising, but just don't do abdominal work. But the thing is, what ends up happening a lot of the times with women, in my observation, is one of two things. One, like you said, Hailey, they just get basically shunned from these classes and excluded because the instructors and the studios are so fearful of working with them because of all of these made up and imagined mythological risks that they end up like just not being able to find a class that they can do. Or if that's not the case, they get into a class and the instructor is still very fearful and basically, puts them on like one red spring for their footwork and, then a few mermaids and maybe just rest for a minute after that. And, maybe some arm work on a half spring, but don't go too far, and that, so that even though they're like, okay, they're moving and they're holding the strap, it's like they're not actually getting anywhere near to stimulating a strengthening response in their muscles or, raising their heart rate or, challenging themselves physiologically in any way. So it's basically they're getting very, very minimal benefits, if any, from the very light, super conservative exercise that they end up doing.
They're getting some stretches. They're getting some really expensive stretches, but they're not getting exercise. They're not getting cardio or resistance training. I've actually observed multiple classes where the prenatal person has just been told to sit this one out. Just sit there for a minute, take a little moment while everyone else does this other thing. Like that would make me not want to pay and go back. I'm like, why am I paying you this much money if to sit in a class and watch everyone else exercise?
Right. And and I can imagine a situation like I just imagine if I'm teaching a session, it's a fairly vigorous session. I've got someone in there that's like 33 weeks pregnant or something, and they've been going hard and they're like, whew, I think I need a moment. I'm like, okay, great. Sure. Take a moment,
Oh yeah, totally. But not like, I don't have an exercise for you. Just sit there.
We've just done like arms in straps on the long box like 5 times in a row, and now I'm not sure what else to do.
So just sit there and breathe while we all do some ab work and then we can come back together. Right.
All right. So, I think that I agree with you on, that there's a conflation, a smushing of a confusion between the role of a Pilates instructor and the role of, say, a women's health physio or, a midwife or whatever in obstetric care of someone who's pregnant. And it's like our job as a Pilates instructor, it's like our job, we're not a health professional. Our job is just to give them a great workout. Just give them a great workout, we're not here to. There's no kind of other mandate other than give them a great workout. And I think that another thing that I think gets thrown into the mix, I think there's a lot of safety culture in general in Pilates, and that I don't think that. I'm absolutely completely convinced of that. And I think that because of the way that Pilates has been taught, by and large, and, dear listener, if you've had a different experience to this, I'd love to hear from you. Click through the show notes, DM me on Instagram. But, by and large, Pilates is taught, over the last, maybe 20, 30 years as a very super detailed, persnickety, perfectionist sort of a, modality, right? Whether you learned classical or contemporary or whatever, it's like there's so much detail and so much perfectionism. And I haven't seen any data on this, but I'd be shocked if there wasn't a higher incidence of perfectionism and anxiety amongst Pilates instructors than in the general population.
I see that in our students when they start the journey, you see it from their previous experience. Yeah.
Right. And if you're sitting there, dear listener, taking notes on this episode in your color-coded, folder and all of your margins are precisely 15 millimeters, you know what we're talking about. And we love you for it. But, we've both got a streak of that in ourselves as well.
I'm just having flashbacks of my interview with you, Raph. Do you remember? And I showed you my color-coded folder. I was like, look at all my Pilates stuff. Yeah. So we know what you're talking about.
Right. So it's not a criticism, but it's just an observation that, and I think that because of that sort of personality trait that a lot of us have in Pilates, then when, that kind of safety message gets, emphasized and emphasized and emphasized within those trainings, it's like that real, we really listen.
We hold on to that.
Yeah. And it becomes one of those things that we sort of, wake at 3 o'clock in the morning and go, oh, what if I did this? I did this exercise tonight. What if I hurt someone, and they come back tomorrow? And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of that. And I think because pregnancy is such an incredible thing, like just the more, it's one of those things that, the more you think about it, the more astounding and astonishing it is, that this happens. That, you just think it's such a miraculous, incredible, process that it is there's kind of a reverence, and I think rightly so, attached to pregnancy, and the process of growing a human and creating a new human, which is so amazing. And so, it's like really it's like that's the meaning of life, right? That's what we're here for. And so there's such a deep emotional kind of, reverence and sense of, wonder and, respect for that whole process. It's like if your grandmother lent you her best ever, crystal decanter that she got for a wedding in 1946, right? And she's like, oh, there you go, darling, but make sure you don't break it. You'd be like, oh.
Hold on to this tight, not going anywhere. Yeah.
And so I think there's a sort of an element of that, the awe, of pregnancy and that whole process, which I think is, rightful, gets conflated with the fact, okay, it's a mystical, amazing, miraculous process, but it's like, yeah, but this woman's still got leg muscles and they still need to be worked.
Yeah. And I think when you talk about the anxiety of the instructor, I think we've got to also look at the anxiety of the prenatal person, because you're never really sure. Like there's things that can happen. So there's a general level of anxiety that you hold once you find out you're pregnant all the way to the point where you have a baby at the end. And because Pilates instructors, I think, never fully have confidence in the guidelines, or, particularly if they haven't been pregnant themselves, they pick up on the anxiety of the client, and it's like twofold, like
it's a feedback loop.
Yeah. And they can't reassure them because they don't have the confidence themselves, and then they just lean into the anxiety of the person in front of them. I feel there's a bit of that.
Yeah, what a great insight. So, yeah, and it's totally normal to feel anxious, particularly, I think, in your first pregnancy, I would imagine, because everything's unknown. You've never been through it before. I imagine by the third or fourth time, you're like, oh, yeah.
I'm definitely more relaxed this time around.
But I think, with that first pregnancy, there's certainly more anxiety. And probably with every pregnancy, there's more anxiety than when you're not pregnant, I imagine. And I think that's probably just a healthy physiological response. Like we know that there's increased sensitivity to pain during pregnancy, and people have increased sensitivity to different foods and things. I think it's just a normal part of, there is a higher, there's not a higher risk, but there's there's a higher cost if anything bad happens, during pregnancy, and so I think it is reasonable and natural for women to be, have some kind of increased level of caution around lots of things, food.
Yeah. I can remember the first time it was like, no mayo, no coffee, like keep all that stuff away. And then this time I'm like, give me all the coffee and give me the mayonnaise.
It'd be interesting to see if your child grows up loving coffee and mayonnaise.
Hopefully not together, but yeah.
Well, who would have thought we'd had coffee with butter in it?
Who thought of that? Anyway.
Coffee with garlic aioli will be the next thing.
It's a full meal for breakfast.
Yeah. So, and I think also, when, a lot of women start exercise when they're pregnant because of that anxiety, and they think, oh, it's a great, it's a new beginning as well, pregnancy for a lot of people. And so it's like, that's a great opportunity to adopt a healthy lifestyle. And so people are like, oh, great. I want to have the best pregnancy. I'm going to take all of the zinc and I'm going to, renovate my house, and I'm going to start exercising and all of that. And so we get a lot of people that kind of maybe first time nervous, mums to be. And then, yeah, like you say, that is kind of that then, we as instructors pick up on that anxiety. And because we don't have, we don't have the confidence that what we know is true, and that we know what we're doing, and this person's safe with us. It's like that, it gets multiplied and reflected back to the woman And that just creates a negative feedback loop where then like we each pick up on each other's anxiety, and yeah, no one is the person, no one is the person providing certainty and calmness, and so anybody who's worked with people who are highly stressed in highly stressful situations will know that, the more stressed that person is, the more relaxed you need to be, when dealing with that person in order to de-escalate the situation. If you match someone's anxiety with your own anxiety, it's not going anywhere good.
You're not getting a good outcome from that. What we need to see is that client with the anxiety met with the confidence of an instructor being like, I got you. Like, I know my guidelines. I know you're just a person. Let's do the thing. It's a bit like working with beginners. I know lots and lots of instructors that don't like working with beginners because they don't know what they're going to be able to do and they're not efficient in their layering. It's like it's the same thing in my mind.
Yeah, 100%. So, all right. So how do we know that it's not true that, prenatal Pilates needs to be gentle, safe, highly modified and complicated?
How do we know that that's not true? I've got a couple of guidelines up my sleeve that tell me so, about 5 of them. But also what I feel is happening in that, let's call it safety culture for lack of a better word, is we are modifying for clients with complications. We are modifying for clients that have pelvic floor issues or have had prolapse in the past or have pelvic dysfunction. Like, we're modifying for all of those people, every single person that's pregnant. And it's just not what needs to happen because that's not every pregnant person's experience.
Right. Yeah. So we think about the edge cases, the 1 in 1,000 women who have some kind of complication, some kind of serious medical complication. And it's like, most of us are way more afraid of things like shark attacks than we need to be, and we're way more afraid of flying, than we need to be. And we're way less afraid of, say, driving in a car than we should be. We should be very afraid of that. It's way more dangerous. Or we should be very afraid of drinking sweetened soft drinks. That's much more dangerous than
a shark attack.
Yeah, exactly. So we have this kind of, and that's just kind of a quirk of our human brain, that we have this heuristic, this kind of rule of thumb. It's like, okay, when you think of something that's like a shark attack, that is like, okay, if a shark attacked you, that would be very, very bad, right? There's no happy ending to that scenario that doesn't involve you having massive bite marks somewhere. So we just have this like natural aversion to that. It's like heights as well. We naturally don't like heights, and that's built from the ancestral environment, but we don't have there's no like ancestral environment, programming for us not to like sweetened soft drinks, or traveling in a car. Like, there's just we don't have an instinct of how dangerous that can be. And so I think it's, we have these outsized fear attached, and we think of the edge cases. Or what if this woman has diabetes, or what if she has, whatever. But it's like, okay, yeah, but that woman shouldn't be in your class in the first place,
Yeah, it's. I think pelvic floor is a really good example of what we're talking about. So many instructors out there get told that as soon as they have a prenatal client, their class needs to accommodate or be working towards supporting someone's pelvic floor. When the truth is, you don't know what's happening for that person. You're not getting in there and doing an exam. That is the role of a pelvic floor physio. And if that person has issues there, they should be seeing that person, because you don't know the situation. And what often happens is that people, cue you to do more, when that's not often the sensation, or that's not often the problem. And we're actually making the situation worse for the prenatal person.
Right. So that's an example of, like you said before, conflating the role of a Pilates instructor with the role of a women's health physio. And when we're thinking, what about people with pelvic floor insufficiency or whatever? It's like, well, they shouldn't be in your class. They should be at the women's health physio.
Yeah, or they should be seeing a women's health physio and coming to your class with the guidance that they're getting from their physio and putting it into place. It's not the instructor's role to be doing that, because they're probably going to be cueing or doing the wrong thing anyway, because it's not their specialty. Their specialty is movement.
Right. And we do have evidence that in order to effectively cue somebody who has pelvic floor dysfunction, urinary incontinence, you actually have to do an internal exam and actually palpate the muscles and to know whether the woman is activating them, too much, too little, at the right time, at the wrong time, whatever it might be. And so it's like, well, you don't know if you're cueing a group of women in a Pilates session. It's like there's no possible way you could know whether that woman is going to be made better, worse, or the same by that cue.
Yeah. Most of the time, they're going to be cued to activate, and most people are overactivating anyway. And so you're actually making the situation worse, actually making birth harder for that person.
So, all right, so there are guidelines, and I think that's a really useful frame of reference as well, is like, don't think about the edge cases. So in both of those guideline snippets I read out, I think it said, women with uncomplicated pregnancies should be encouraged to exercise before, during, and after pregnancy, essentially. And so what they mean by that, there's a list of what they call contraindications to exercise in pregnancy, or there's basically medical conditions that if you have them, it's not considered an uncomplicated pregnancy. And I have them here in front of me as it happens.
Here's something I prepared earlier.
So, or maybe I don't have them as handy as I thought I did. Contraindications for exercise during pregnancy, according to the American College of Sports Medicine, 2021. Hemodynamically significant heart disease. Okay, so hemo means blood, dynamic is movement, so the movement of blood around your body. So hemodynamically significant heart disease means your heart is not moving blood around your body enough, and that it's significant, right? So basically, you've got heart failure is what they would call that. Incompetent cervix, cervical insufficiency or cerclage, and that's basically where your cervix is essentially leaks and amniotic fluid, okay, is potentially leaking out, or just it's not, the uterus is descending through the cervix, essentially. Intrauterine growth restriction, multiple gestation at risk for premature labour, persistent second or third trimester bleeding, placenta previa after 26 to 28 weeks of gestation. So placenta previa is where the placenta is over. Now, I think it's where the placenta is over the cervix partly. Is that correct? Do you know, Hailey?
I'm not 100% sure, but
I'm just going to quickly Google it. Hey, I'm pretty sure it's basically, I think it's where the placenta is basically, attached to some, not the normal part of the uterine lining. Placenta previa. Placenta previa is a problem during pregnancy when the placenta completely or partially covers the opening of the cervix. There you go.
There you go. You were spot on.
If the placenta is covering the cervix after 26 weeks of gestation. Preeclampsia or pregnancy-induced hypertension. So preeclampsia is a life-threatening condition that is a sequelae, so like something that follows from hypertension, so high blood pressure during pregnancy, and basically women can spontaneously bleed and bleed out very easily because the blood pressure goes through the roof. And during labour, especially, obviously, there's real decent chance of bleeding because you're ripping the placenta out of the uterine lining. So yeah, that's very, very significant. Premature labour during the current pregnancy, restrictive lung disease, ruptured membranes, severe anemia, uncontrolled or poorly controlled hypertension, which is high blood pressure, uncontrolled thyroid disease, uncontrolled type 1 diabetes. So this is not just type 1 diabetes, but uncontrolled. Like, so you're having like fainting episodes because of low blood sugar or high blood sugar or whatever it might be. unexplained persistent vaginal bleeding, such as in second or third trimester. Like, all right, so that's a complete list of the absolute contraindications to exercise in pregnancy according to the ACSM. Now, I think if you're listening, you'd probably consider all of those to be serious medical conditions, right? They're like, oh, fuck, I've got that. That's bad. Okay. This is not like garden variety backache or, I've got a touch of the flu or, my elbow's been hurting. I'm not sure why. This is not pelvic pain. These are serious medical conditions, right? So if you don't have one of these, it's considered an uncomplicated pregnancy. Now there are some relative contraindications as well, which are, so absolute contraindications are if you have one of those, you shouldn't be exercising in a group setting. You should be working directly with an allied health professional, like a women's health physio or an exercise physiologist or something like that. Relative contraindications are you'd probably need to significantly modify exercise. So anemia or symptomatic anemia, cervical dilation, chronic bronchitis, eating disorder, extreme morbid obesity, heavy smoker, history of spontaneous preterm birth, premature labour, miscarriage or fetal growth restriction, malnutrition or extreme underweight, mild or moderate cardiovascular disease, orthopedic limitations, poorly controlled seizure disorder, poorly controlled type 1 diabetes, recurrent pregnancy loss, unevaluated maternal cardiac arrhythmia, other significant medical conditions. So those are the relative contraindications. So if you don't have any of those or any absolute contraindications, all of those are pretty serious
things as well. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not like you've got a bit of a sore back or something. And so if you don't have any of those, that's considered an uncomplicated pregnancy. And what the ACSM and ACOG both say is that for a healthy woman with an uncomplicated pregnancy, the risks of not exercising far outweigh the risks of exercising, and that women should be encouraged to exercise before, during, and after pregnancy.
Yeah, 100%. It's like it couldn't be any clearer why we should be empowering prenatal people to move. It shouldn't be any clearer why we should make prenatal, training courses just like not even a thing. We should just be giving everyone a set of the guidelines and being like, here's what you do, off you go and do them. So,
yeah, once you read the guidelines and once you read a few different sets of guidelines and realise they all basically say the same thing, there are a few minor variations, like ACSM says no prolonged supine after 15 weeks or 14 weeks or something, whereas
I think they're at 13 now. Yeah.
They've upped the ante.
They've gone a bit further. Yeah, the weeks is the biggest variance. ACSM is 13, ACOG is 20. I think RANCOG is 16, and the Department of Health is 28. But the general rule is the same. We're avoiding maintaining a supine position at a certain point in person's pregnancy. And maybe the easier way to look at that is when the person is no longer comfortable.
So sometime between the start of second trimester and the start of third trimester, that's when you should stop. You should avoid prolonged supine work. So, you can do, say, shoulder bridge where your butt touches the floor for like 1 second in between reps, right? But don't do 100 followed by, the series of 5,
Don't program a 10-minute supine sequence, perhaps. Yeah.
And then that's one of the 4 things we need to, take into consideration, which is sometime, depending on which guidelines you want to look at, is sometime between 13 weeks, which is the start of trimester 2, and 28 weeks, which is roughly sort of the start of trimester 3. We should avoid prolonged supine exercise. And so for that, you can still do a little bit, for a few seconds, or you can just figure out an alternate way to work your abs, do planks or, side lying ab work, or
so many ways you can work your abs.
Or you could just prop them up, like whack a bolster under their ribs sort of thing. All right, so what are the other things we need to be aware of?
I think this next one I usually go to is pretty straightforward. We want to avoid any blunt force trauma, or basically, if we're looking at it in a Pilates context, avoid falling on your tummy.
Right. So if we were, in a broader context, we'd say avoid things like, playing soccer, where someone might kick a ball into your belly. Maybe avoid skydiving, horse riding, those types of things. But given that we're Pilates instructors, it's like avoid, standing on the reformer in a side splits with a light spring on.
Yeah. Or, doing some crazy handstandy things on a light spring, or, have a really light spring on and you're facing towards the foot bar. Like, let's start in a low kneel. Let's just consider our options. But we still so many things we can do in a Pilates class that don't involve those things. I did a whole class on it this morning if you want to check it out.
And so, what do you do, when everyone's doing side splits? What does the pregnant woman do? Or even better question, how do you program your class so that instead of everyone doing side splits and you're giving a different modification to that woman, how do you just give everyone something that is pregnancy friendly, but you don't go, hey, everyone, it's pregnancy friendly?
Yeah, that would be my preference. I really want to get everybody doing the same thing. So do some side stuff from the floor. Have one foot on the floor and one foot on the reformer. Do your side splits, do your squats, do your skaters. Works beautifully. You can have a box if you need to. There's lots of other ways where you can do those sorts of lunges, like using the back of the reformer or standing next to the reformer and doing it with some straps.
All right. So avoid prolonged supine after somewhere between second and third trimester. Avoid essentially falling. Okay. So no side splits on a light spring, and probably clean up that freaking Bosu off the floor. Don't leave it lying.
Put your hand weights underneath your reformer. Yeah.
All of that stuff. What's the next one?
The next one that often gets a bit confused, I think, in my mind, is keeping people cool and hydrated.
Yeah. All right. So this is a guideline recommendation in all the guidelines: avoid overheating and stay hydrated. How do you think this gets confused?
I think the avoid overheating in particular gets conflated to don't let your client get their heart rate up. Don't let them get a little bit hot and sweaty. It's like, oh no, you have to stay cool. Like, there is a nuance in that. Yes.
Yeah. And I think I stick my hand up because I feel like I've probably been guilty of not conveying that nuance very well and just assuming that people would make sense of it. And so recently, the last couple of months, fairly recently taught the prenatal sequence in the diploma, and I made sure that we kind of distinguish between, okay, well, actually the reason for that recommendation of avoid overheating is because significantly raising the body temperature, particularly in first trimester, has been associated with increased rate of neural tube defects. So things that result in conditions like spina bifida. And so that is a genuine consideration that we have to be aware of. But when they talk about, raising body temperature, what they're talking about is significantly, hot environments, like basically women doing, manual labor in the desert, or working in a tin shed in the middle of summer.
Yeah, or doing Bikram yoga where you're in like a 36-degree studio working out for 90 minutes. Yeah.
And the increase in body temperature that occurs with exercise, when exercise is in a roughly thermoneutral environment, so in other words, where the outside temperature is roughly equivalent to the body temperature, the increase in body temperature that occurs in that situation is not, probably anywhere near enough to, cause any kind of risk, in terms of neural tube defects. And I just want to I'll just read you out a passage in relation to this from ACOG. Excuse me. It says, temperature regulation is highly dependent on hydration and environmental conditions. So that's like how hydrated you are, and also the temperature in the outside world. During exercise, pregnant women should stay well hydrated, wear loose-fitting clothing, and avoid high heat and humidity to protect against heat stress, particularly during the first trimester. Although exposure to heat from sources such as hot tubs, saunas, or fever has been associated with an increased risk of neural tube defects, exercise would not be expected to increase core body temperature into the range of concern. At least one study found no association between exercise and neural tube defects. So what that's saying is when you exercise, so if you're in an air-conditioned Pilates studio doing some mermaids or even doing some jump board work, you might get a bit red and sweaty. But that is the amount that your core body temperature is going to rise is nowhere near the zone of danger where you would get if you hopped into a hot bath and soaked there for half an hour, where basically it's impossible for you to shed heat because the environment is higher temperature than your internal environment. So you're actually taking on heat from the environment. Whereas in a Pilates class, as long as you're wearing loose-fitting clothing that allows you to shed heat and you're well hydrated, and the temperature in the room is, roughly kind of sort of body temperature, thereabouts. It's like it's very unlikely, and there's no evidence that exercise can cause any kind of increase in body temperature into any danger zone. So, and in fact, we've got lots of case studies of women running marathons and things, when 8 months pregnant. So, I don't think a bit of jump board's going to.
No, I don't think a little red flushed face is going to be the end of the world. And there's actually ACOG I think maybe it's both of them, actually talk about intensity of exercise, don't they? So there's a recommendation there. So it's like people get confused with this, keep them cool and hydrated, as don't let them get sweaty or work up anything and keep them having breaks all the time, when actually we're confusing core temperature and neural defects with intensity of exercise, which are different things.
Yeah, so you're exactly right, Hailey. I'm just going to read that quote that you just alluded to from ACOG, which says, quote, vigorous intensity exercise completed into the third trimester appears to be safe for most healthy pregnancies, end quote. So you don't need to worry. And when ACOG talks about vigorous intensity exercise, they mean like running up a sand dune, Yeah,
not me doing some cardio jumps on my reformer box, which got some people upset.
All right, so that's 3. The first one is avoid prolonged supine from from end of first to end of second trimester, somewhere in that range. Start of second, start of third trimester. Avoid the risk of blunt trauma to the abdomen. So in other words, avoid things where there's a risk of falling. And then the third one is stay well hydrated and maintain, don't overheat. But that really, I think, should be like avoid exercising in a hot or humid environment is probably a better.
Yes, much clearer. Yeah, definitely.
So definitely no hot Pilates, no hot yoga. If it's the middle of summer and the air conditioning is broken, probably don't go to class today.
Yeah, or a class in the middle of the park on a 40-degree day.
Right. But if you're in an air-conditioned Pilates studio and you're dressed, sensibly, there's basically nothing you could do that would elevate your body temperature, dangerously. So just go for gold. All right. And what's the fourth thing we need to think about?
Fourth thing that we need to think about, which I don't specifically think is applicable just to prenatal clients, I think it's applicable to everybody, is comfort. So, for example, there's nothing in the 3 that you've mentioned so far that says that I can't lie on my tummy, but pulling straps, plow and tee, probably not on the menu at the moment.
You haven't figured out a way to just put the middle of your thighs on the box? And
I haven't yet and have my arms floating in space. No, I haven't worked that one out. Yeah. I like that there's nuance to comfort. I like that we don't have to just say prenatal people shouldn't lie on their tummy, because I have been enjoying exploring, where my limits are and where I can make those things work. But I do think it's a really valid consideration, but it's also a valid consideration for people with larger chests that don't like lying on their tummy, or breastfeeding people that don't like lying on their tummy, It's just look at the person in front of you.
Right. Or sometimes men in swan dive.
Ah, yes. There's a comfort issue.
Yeah. That's why it's much better on the ladder barrel, in my experience. Yeah, and I think so. The three that we've mentioned, avoid prolonged supine from sort of start of second trimester, maybe start of third trimester, somewhere in there. Let's say I'm going to say 20 weeks because I like the ACOG guidelines; they're my favourite ones. Avoid risk of falling in place, studio environment. Stay hydrated and don't exercise in hot or humid environment. Okay, so those are the considerations that are listed in ACOG. Now, ACSM has a further one, which is avoid the Valsalva maneuver and breath holding. ACOG doesn't specify that. And it's interesting to me that's like, okay, well, what about the, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pregnant women who've been following the ACOG guidelines and haven't died, So maybe the Valsalva thing isn't such a big deal. But aside from that, there are no other modifications, right? So there are those kind of contraindications that we talked about, hemodynamically significant heart disease, etc. Okay. And then there are those three considerations, is what they call them, in the guidelines: the supine, the hydration / hot humid environment, and the risk of falling. And aside from that, that's it. There are no other considerations. That's it. And so the comfort one is not even in the guidelines. We just added it. We're like, okay, well, probably some people aren't going to enjoy doing the roll up or the roll over when they're 36-week pregnant. Probably some people aren't going to enjoy doing like swimming, whatever. And there will be some people who don't enjoy some things, but other people we totally fine with those things.
Exactly. And I think that's where some of this other discussion comes from of like, well, all prenatal people shouldn't do lunges or single leg work. It's like, well, why? Why? There is nothing to support that. Some people have discomfort later term in their pregnancy with that, in which case, what do you do if somebody has discomfort in kneeling? Or what do you do if somebody has discomfort on their wrists?
Yeah, you reduce the range of motion, reduce the load, or just pick a different exercise.
But we don't need to limit every single person from doing that because some people have discomfort.
Right, and I think that particular one, that lunges, and I'd probably throw in side splits, get thrown into that basket as well. There's a fear around stretching, and I know that in some trainings that is emphasised that, you shouldn't stretch pregnant clients, particularly for side splits and front splits because of relaxin. And there's a myth that there's a higher risk of injury in that situation, and that the pain is because of pelvic instability. And there's quite a bit of evidence that is not true now. Like, we know that relaxin levels during pregnancy don't correlate with pelvic pain. Pelvic pain's a thing, relaxin's a thing, but some women have more or less of one and not of the other. We know that the laxity of the sacroiliac joint doesn't correlate with pelvic pain, but asymmetric laxity of the sacroiliac joint does correlate with an increased chance of pelvic pain. So there's something in there around asymmetry, and maybe that's the brain interpreting the asymmetry as like, getting a kind of a mismatch between the perceptions of the positional sense of the pelvis and interpreting that as danger, and it doesn't make sense that it's the laxity of the joint causing like a risk there, because if that joint's lax and it hurts, but the other one's not lax and doesn't hurt, but what if the other one was equally lax, then they don't hurt, right? So how does the other one being lax make the first one being lax less dangerous? That doesn't make sense. It's like if your left tire is bald, how does the right tire being bald make that, more safe? So we've got a bunch of other evidence around, correlation with straight leg raise, or lack of correlation with straight leg raise, and also just postnatal women who have been diagnosed with persistent pelvic pain and quote pelvic instability, end quote, and then just whacking them in X-ray machines and X-raying their pelvis and finding out that basically they've got absolutely zero or less than 1 degree of movement, like 0.2 degrees of movement or something like that in the sacroiliac joint on the quote loose side. So so pelvic pain is a real thing. And if people have pain in lunging or splitting or whatever, it's like, well, just do what you would do if it was a footballer who had pain with lunging or splitting. Just go, well, why don't we give you a bit more support there? Okay. Why don't we reduce the range of motion? Why don't we shorten the lever? And if none of those things work, why don't we just give you different exercise?
Exactly. I love your example of, a sports person with an injury. You just tailor the program to what they need, and they're pretty simple options, particularly from a reformer. You got springs, you got range, you can just change it up. We don't need to be avoiding these things or putting the fear of God in instructors that they can't be teaching these things, because they can.
Right. And if you read through, which I know you have, the ACSM guidelines and the ACOG guidelines, and you read every single word, and this is what we do in the diploma, is we read through every single word of the guidelines. And then we say, where does it say don't do the splits? And it's like, well, it doesn't say that anywhere. It's not mentioned. In the ACSM guidelines, it does, in fact, recommend what they call the FIT guidelines, of frequency, intensity, time, and type of exercise that pregnant women should do. And what they say is, quote, the general principles of exercise prescription apply to adults of all ages. Sorry, I'm reading from the older adults there. Sorry, pregnancy. Exercise prescription. In the absence of obstetric or medical complications, so those are the things we read out before, contraindications, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists recommend 20 to 30 minutes a day of moderate intensity aerobic exercise on most or all days of the week during pregnancy. Exercise recommendations for pregnant women should be modified according to the woman's prior exercise history, as well as symptoms, discomforts, and abilities across pregnancy time course, with consideration of absolute and relative contraindications. So that's just what we said, right? So, if it hurts, try doing a bit smaller movement, or, making the load a bit easier, or dropping your knee or whatever. And if that's really a problem, just pick a different movement. But apart from that, just modify based on exercise history. So if she's strong and fit, it's like, great, give her the exercises appropriate for a strong and fit person. If she's a beginner, give her exercises appropriate for a beginner. Not a pregnant beginner.
Not a pregnant beginner, just a beginner.
Right. There was this, I always think about this now. I can't help it. It's just a thought loop that happens in my mind. I saw this when the whole gay marriage thing was going on a couple of years back, and there was a lot of agitation and activism to get gay marriage legalized. There was a skit I saw. It was like, gay marriage, or as we like to call it, marriage. It's like it's just marriage, right? It's just marriage, and it's like, prenatal exercise, or as we like to call it, exercise. It's just exercise. It's just exercise.
I'd love to focus in and talk for a moment, if we can, about what you just said about if they're a beginner, they're a beginner client. If they're an advanced client, they're an advanced client. But what I've heard so often is beginner clients that have found out that they're pregnant, and they've gone into a space because they've been told that exercise is good for them, and they've been sent away because they've never done Pilates before. Can we talk about that?
Yeah. All right. So why do you want to talk about that?
It just stuck out to me when you said that. Like, if they're a beginner, treat them like a beginner. If they're advanced, treat them like they're advanced. But I've heard so many instances of beginner prenatal clients being turned away from even starting because they're beginners. And it's like, well, why can't we just treat them like a beginner? Because if we're treating them like a person, and exercise is good at all stages of pregnancy.
Yeah. Well, what do the guidelines say on this point, Hailey?
Oh, you're going to make me bring them up. I can't read it because it's not in front of me, but exercise should be started gradually, but it's not to be avoided.
Yeah, I have got it in front of me.
I knew you would.
The ACOG guidelines say pregnancy is an ideal time for maintaining or adopting a healthy lifestyle. It's a great time to start exercise.
Let's not send them away. Let's bring them in.
This is again from ACOG, quote, physical activity and exercise in pregnancy are associated with minimal risks and have been shown to benefit most women, although some modifications to exercise routines may be necessary because of normal anatomic and physiological changes and fetal requirements. Now, sidebar, we just said what those are, right? Those modifications. Avoid supine, prolonged supine after 20 weeks if you're following the ACOG guidelines. Avoid risk of falling. Avoid exercising in hot and humid environments, maintain hydration. Right, those are the modifications that we have to make. Right, so modifications to exercise routines may be necessary because of the normal anatomic and physiological changes in pregnancy and fetal requirements. Back to the ACOG guidelines. Quote, in the absence of obstetric or medical complications or contraindications, which we read out what they were, physical activity in pregnancy is safe and desirable, and pregnant women should be encouraged to continue or initiate safe physical activities, end quote. Now, I just want to, before we go on with this, I want to go, when they say safe physical activities, box 1, this is again ACOG quote, examples of exercises that have been extensively studied in pregnancy and found to be safe and beneficial. Walking, stationary cycling, aerobic exercise, dancing, resistance exercises, e.g. using weights, elastic bands, stretching exercises, hydrotherapy, water aerobics, end quote. So they are example of exercises that have been extensively studied in pregnancy and found to be safe and beneficial, direct quote, from ACOG, including resistance exercises and stretching exercises.
They were the two that I wanted to talk about. It's like we're encouraging people to stretch and pick up heavy things.
Right. And in ACSM, in the FIT recommendations for exercise during pregnancy, they recommend stretching. Within those guidelines. Flexibility training, I'm now quoting from the ACSM, 2 or more days per week, stretch to the point of feeling tightness or slight discomfort, hold for 30 to 60 seconds. Do any type of physical activities that maintain or increase flexibility using slow movements that terminate in static stretches for each muscle group rather than rapid ballistic movements. So that is end quote. That is from the ACSM on what you should do when you're pregnant in terms of stretching. So stretch 2 or more days per week to the point of mild discomfort and hold it for 30, 60 seconds. Yeah. So nothing to see here, folks. Just go on about your business.
Just teach your Pilates class.
Right. And so if I come in and I'm 25 weeks pregnant and I've got quite a bump there and I say, you know what, Hailey, I'm not really feeling the old swimming today, or maybe the double leg kick, I don't feel comfortable to do that. Maybe roll up, I don't feel comfortable to do because in the end position I feel kind of all crunched up, over my tummy. Maybe roll over, I'm not crazy about. I feel like suffocated. There's probably a few other exercises that I might not enjoy as much now that I'm late second trimester. What do you do in that situation? A, panic.
Panic and run out of the room. I can't do this. What we've just been speaking about, like if your client is prepared enough to come in and go, I don't feel comfortable doing these exercises. Awesome. We won't do those. We'll do the other 31 exercises that you do feel comfortable doing. Or if they don't know at that point and you're running your class and gets to something and it's like, well, this doesn't feel great for me. Exactly the things that you just said before. Great. If we're on a reformer, can we change the springs? If we're doing mat or reformer, can we make the movement smaller? If that really still doesn't work, let's do something else. But most of the time, those first 2 will cover what you need to do.
Right. And there are a couple of get out of jail free cards. Like you can do most things side lying instead, like hundreds or double leg kick or whatever. You can do kind of a wonky version of those things side lying. You can prop people up with a bolster under their shoulders, so they're not supine anymore. there are lots of things you can do. And it's just one or two exercises like the rollover. Okay, that kind of sucks. There's not really a fun way of doing it when you're 30 weeks pregnant, I imagine. So it's like, let's just not do the rollover today, folks,
I don't know. I'm a bit of a sicko. I still love it. It's just a prop under the butt. I'm like, yeah, I'm happy.
And so how would you know at the start of class, just say the woman comes in and she doesn't have a pre-written list of exercises that she's not comfortable doing, like most clients, I imagine, right? And so she's just there and she's like, oh, it's, my first day in class, or I'm been doing classes, but I haven't done your class before or whatever. And you're just like, okay, well, I had this class planned, I'm not sure if I didn't specifically plan it to be prenatal friendly. What do you do in that situation?
Oh, first and foremost, let's check in with the person. Welcome. How are you feeling? And what most people, well, my experience is most people want to overshare when you ask them how they're feeling. Oh, I'm great, but I just don't feel good doing this and this. And you go, okay, cool. And you've got that information to plan your class. But I also think it's not a bad idea to just have a prenatal class programmed that doesn't involve any supine, it doesn't involve any crazy overhead stuff that you can pull out if you've got a surprise prenatal client, and nobody needs to know it's a prenatal client. Your ab work's done in supine, your butt work's done in side lying with a bit of standing, There's so many wonderful exercises that we can do that are appropriate for everyone that you can layer up to serious spice if you want to, that just don't involve lying on your tummy.
So when you said the ad work's done in supine, did you mean in prone?
Oh, sorry, I did. I meant 4-point kneeling.
So, yeah, I love that concept, and we've talked about that on the show before about having a prenatal-friendly class that just happens to not have any supine or prone work in it, but you don't call it a prenatal class. You don't say, hey, everyone, this is vegan beef. It's not real beef, what do you like? You just say, hey, here's your burger, and then afterwards they're like, oh, that was an awesome burger. And you're like, yeah, it was, wasn't it? And it's like, they don't need to know it was prenatal friendly.
But at the end of the day, it wasn't even a prenatal class. It was a Pilates class that didn't involve supine. We're calling it a prenatal Pilates class, but it was just a Pilates class.
Right. Well, I actually deliberately called it a prenatal friendly class because it's not, I wouldn't class it as we might be doing hella push-ups and squats and whatever, right? But it's just we happen to not do any prone work, and that's what makes it prenatal friendly in my mind.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to make that distinction because I feel particularly when I talk to other instructors that work at studios, they're like, oh, we're running particular prenatal classes and I don't know what to program for it and I don't know how to program for prenatal people. And it's like, well, let's just lose that for a minute. What does a class look like if it doesn't have any prone or supine in it? There's your class, and teach that to everybody, and you can teach that outside of your special prenatal classes if you want to. Yeah.
And I actually, I've got mixed feelings about special prenatal classes. Just as a business owner, we used to run them when I had my studio, and they're kind of feast or famine because what happens is all the women eventually, they come to full term, they give birth, and then they stay home. Right. A lot of them don't come back straight away because we were in the CBD. So people didn't live near us. So they came to work in the CBD while they were pregnant. And then they went on maternity leave when they were 8 months. And they come to a few classes after that because they were swanning around, not doing much. But then once they give birth, it's well, they're living out in the suburbs and the last thing they're going to do is travel into the city. It's what the heck are they going to do with the baby, all of that. So it's basically the class fills up, but then it empties out. And then you have to find a whole bunch of new clients. It's oh, crap. Whereas if you just accommodate those people within a regular class setting, it's it's not an issue in my experience. Where do you sit on that whole thing?
I couldn't agree more. I think that the idea of having prenatal specific classes is that you are different from everybody else. You can't go to a normal class because you need special attention and special programming, and I think it goes against everything that we've just spoken about today.
It's just, and what do you do in these prenatal classes? Hold on, we just did push-ups and squats and yep. Okay. So what advice do you have for people, who are maybe listening to this and, nodding their heads furiously and banging the car dashboard. Yes. But then they have to coexist in a world, whether they maybe work with a coworker or an employer, or maybe it's just people on social media, or the people in their, I don't know, their people that they were trained by, the original training that they did, taught them a certain thing, and they're still holding on to that textbook at home because it's got kind of like, I held on to my textbooks from my Pilates certification for ages. They had kind of sentimental value, to all of, there's a scribble I wrote when so-and-so told me that cue or whatever. So what advice do you have to people, for people basically who, are working hard to become fearless in their prenatal teaching, or maybe are already there, but are struggling with just the amount of fear-based, bullshit basically that is being thrown by probably well-meaning people from all sides. The hand grenades are coming from all angles.
Being attacked from everywhere.
Yeah, and not necessarily being attacked directly, but I mean just there's a lot of negative messaging around prenatal Pilates and a lot of fear-based messaging. And, even if it's not directed at someone specifically, but it's just like it's in the water, it's kind of like yeah. So what advice do you have for people who have to work within that sort of ecosystem?
I guess something that I picked up from listening to a podcast with you actually is when there are those conversations to be had, I try and make them as open as I can. So rather than come in with, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing, it's, would you like to engage in a conversation about this? So I use the guidelines quite heavily. I actually have a copy printed when I teach in class that I take with me. And I've been using that a lot on Instagram as well. People that have, I wasn't even doing a very heavy ab sequence. I was doing a quite light curl up sequence, and the comments on there was, quite full on in terms of she is going to give herself a hernia. Doesn't she know anything about working with prenatal clients? Doesn't she know that you're not supposed to be doing any ab work, any curl up work with prenatal clients? Was just, I love that you brought that to the table so we could have a conversation about it. Would you be willing to talk about why I'm doing the things that I'm doing? And I have found that to be quite helpful. It's
interesting that you mentioned ab curls and I would say hysteria that surrounds ab curls in pregnancy and even postpartum for women with diastasis. It's like just about the most controversial thing you can say, I think, in Pilates is like it's safe to do ab curls in pregnancy. It's like that seems like such an innocuous thing to say.
Or planks. Planks are pretty. Yeah, sorry, go.
Planks are up there too. Yeah, you're right.
I've done a few plank series and people have been like, she shouldn't be doing that.
Huh. It's so interesting, isn't it? And it's like we get back to what we said at the start. People have such strongly held views based on no evidence. The evidence being like, oh, that's what my teacher taught me when I was in my Pilates course or some weekend certification. But it's like, well, did they show you the guidelines? Obviously not, because if they had, then you would have noticed that that's not part of what the guidelines say. In fact, I'm just going to read from the ACOG guidelines, quote, abdominal strengthening exercises, including abdominal crunch exercises, have been shown to decrease the incidence of diastasis recti abdominis and decrease the interrectus distance. That's the distance between the left and the right halves of the rectus abdominis muscle, or the width of the linea alba, in other words, in women who gave birth vaginally or by cesarean birth. So abdominal strengthening exercises, including abdominal crunch exercises. Yeah. So, and yet then we have this kind of mass kind of insanity of people just almost throwing tantrums, about people doing a crunch.
And I mean, I've observed it from 13 weeks. Like people have been like, oh no, you can't do it. Like some people aren't even visibly pregnant at 13 weeks. Why are we saying you can't do any of this now? It's just, it blows my mind.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where it's, Yeah, I mean, we don't have time to do a whole conversation about diastasis and ab curls, but there's just
next interview, next one.
Like it's like, again, if you've read the guidelines, like it's not a thing. In fact, it's the opposite. Like what research we do have on abdominal strengthening during, before and after pregnancy unanimously shows that exercise, and particular abdominal exercise, including abdominal curl exercises, reduce the incidence and the severity of diastasis. Like there is absolutely 0.000 studies showing that abdominal crunches, increase the risk or severity of diastasis. None. Zero. Zip.
Yeah. And I like to link it back to what you said at the beginning. Like when you look, like there's risks to everything. Is the risk of I'm possibly maybe going to have some diastasis after birth, which you pretty much have anyway. Like
you do. 100% of women. Yeah.
I'm not going to go to my classes anymore. I can't find anywhere to go. I've been sent to a clinical one-on-one session that I cannot afford to attend. I'm just not going to do anything. And then you fall into the sedentary category. Like it doesn't make sense to me that we're so hysterical down this end.
You go to class and you're moving, but so slowly and with so little load that you still fall into the sedentary category.
All for the sake of doing a little bit of crunchy.
Is there anything else you'd like to add before we finish up?
No, I think we've covered everything that I hoped that we would. It's just Pilates. It's not Pilates. It's just Pilates. There's so many things that you can do that just work for a whole class, that just happen to suit a prenatal client. They don't have to be prenatal specific. And just like with any other human being, if you've got severe discomfort, change it until it's comfortable.
Right. So just program your class, just like a normal class, not a prenatal class. Just program a class, cross out all the supine exercises and all the prone exercises and replace them with side lying, standing, kneeling or quadruped exercises. Bam. There's your prenatal class.
And stop thinking you need a PhD to be a Pilates instructor. There's people that do that.
Right. It's just exercise, people. Yeah. All right. Good talk, Hailey.
Thanks for having me, Raph.